We started the initiative about a decade ago because we had the sense that this was an important, not just for the climate, but important in the developing world. You have 500 million people that still have no access to energy, mostly in Africa, but in other countries as well. There's also the economic issues. There's a tremendous amount of gas that's wasted through flaring and methane emissions in oil and gas infrastructure. And then the fourth reason is energy security, and you might have heard a lot of that energy security being an issue in the last few years. The idea was to raise the visibility of flaring and methane as an important issue that oil and gas companies and operators and governments need to address, and then to sort of set a target for industry and governments as well. Because at the time, leading into the Paris COP, there wasn't a lot of visibility on this issue. Some progress has been made. We have over 100 governments and oil companies, gas companies that have made this commitment, but the progress has been slow, especially in the developing world where you have a lack of resources, or you still have issues of making these difficult choices between, do we address this issue or that issue? What we're happy to see is that those companies and governments that have endorsed the Zero Routine Flaring Initiative are performing better and have made substantive progress, especially when it comes to flaring intensity. Flaring intensity is the amount of gas flared per barrel of oil produced, as opposed to the overall volume of gas that's been flared. So we've seen about a 12% reduction in flaring intensity in those countries and those companies that have actually made the commitment to zero routine flaring. So some progress, but in the next 5 years, we need to see a lot more. When we've seen politically, perhaps, some countries and governments not paying as much attention to the climate agenda as perhaps they had previously, you have to recognize that this is not just a climate issue. In many developing countries, there's a country we're working in just now, where we did a pilot program on methane emissions and identifying them and mitigating those emissions, leaks, if you will, the fugitive methane emissions. And we discovered that if they just kept that gas in the pipeline, in their value chain, in their system, they would save millions of dollars annually. So what we've said to these companies and governments is, if you fix these leaks, if you address your flaring, you're going to see more revenue generated for your country as well as your company. Reinvest a portion of that money that you've saved by selling the additional gas into your system and constantly do these leak detection and repair campaigns, and use that money to continuously monitor your infrastructure and your gas value chain to ensure that you're not losing this money, you're not losing the gas that could be utilized for all sorts of economically productive purposes as well. You've got countries where the oil production takes place in remote regions, perhaps in the middle of Siberia, as is the case with Russia. In other countries in Latin America, it could be in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. So how do you address the emissions in those cases? How do you get rid of the flaring? And you can't just build a pipeline through a rainforest. It's not feasible, it's not economically viable. There are modular solutions in those cases. So some companies and operators, what they're doing is they're taking that associated gas and they're using it to generate power in their own operations right there in that same vicinity. Or you could see in a place like Africa where the gas flaring is taking place in a remote village, but the village still doesn't have access to energy. So why wouldn't you take that associated gas that's currently being wasted and find a way to generate power for the villagers? So there are many countries around the world that have put in good, effective regulations, and those regulations then incentivize these oil companies and governments. Rather than wastefully flaring the gas, they would actually then find it more economically viable to do something with that gas. But you have to have the enforcement side of the regulation. So you see some countries where they have good, effective regulations in place, but then they're not enforcing that regulation and they're not monitoring it effectively to make sure that the operators within their jurisdiction are actually complying. So where the real problem exists is in the financing and the economic side of things. And that's where the World Bank is coming in and helping these operators and governments identify economically viable solutions. We estimate there's quite a few projects around the world that would be the case if the operator, again, just focused on that and made this a priority and had the political will to do something about it. So we started a new trust fund just last year. It's called the Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership. This is a fund that's supported by governments like the UAE, strong support from the UAE, the United States of America, Norway, some of the leading oil producing countries in the world, and then a lot of the international oil companies like Shell, BP, Eni, Equinor, Occidental, they all contributing to this fund. And what we want to do with this new trust fund at the World Bank is two things. We'll continue to provide developing country governments with technical advice, technical assistance, help them create the enabling environment, if you will, to make gas flaring and methane reduction far more viable. And then on the other side, what we also will do is provide some grant funding to these operators. So in the developing world, lack of resources is, of course, one of the main issues. We call it catalytic because if the World Bank comes in and identifies a project with some good grant funding, then there's a good chance that other lending institutions, whether they be concessional financiers, commercial financiers, would say, look, this might be a project that we could also come in and support, with the World Bank providing a little bit of a risk assurance and also contributing some financing in that case. If you were to say that methane emissions are the second largest contributor to climate change after CO2, however, it's a far more potent greenhouse gas. And if you look at methane emissions, you're talking about the oil and gas sector being responsible for somewhere around a third of all methane emissions globally. So it's a huge chunk. Now, within that third, you could say the developing world, all of these national oil companies in the developing world are primarily responsible, about 50% responsible for all the methane emissions. So the World Bank has a really good case to make why they should be engaged in this and why the support is needed. Again, it's not just the climate, it's also the economic value that's lost, it's also the energy access issues, and then it's also the energy security, as everybody has been talking about for the last few years. When we launched the initiative a decade ago, we did think 2030 would be achievable. That's 15 years. A lot of these gas flaring reduction projects do take a long time. It's several years, really. So even if you built that in, we thought it was doable. Now, a decade in and not showing the progress as much as we wanted, 2030 does seem to be a stretch goal. But we will hopefully see some governments, some countries, some operators actually achieve that target. In fact, there are some major international oil companies that have the technical capacity and the resources. They're already going to achieve that, if not beat it by a few years. So that's encouraging, and hopefully they'll set an example for other operators to do the same, to prioritize this and get senior management at these companies to say, no, we have to do this. This oil industry practice that has persisted for 160 some years now, ever since oil production began, it now needs to end.